Hello everyone, and welcome to our Zoom meeting on grief, the water trinity and the mother-daughter archetype. I'll be co-hosting this meeting with Sue Hillyard and Sarrah West. Our volunteers will be mother and daughter, Susan and Brianna. Grief is a fundamental, inescapable and essential part of being human. Grief is a response to loss, particularly through the death of someone we have loved. It is the emotional suffering one feels when something or someone the individual loves is taken away. The more significant losses of a parent, spouse or child, the more intense the grief is likely to be. Through loss, we face the finality of death and our own mortality. Many types of loss can cause grief, such as divorce, illness, loss of job, financial loss, miscarriage, retirement, death of a pet, loss of a cherished dream, loss of a friendship, moving home, or the loss of safety after a trauma. It has been said that the price of love is grief. The way one grieves is unique to each person. Using excessive food, alcohol, or drugs when one is grieving is harmful because the emotional issues are buried. Attitudes such as be strong need to be avoided because they suppress the natural grieving process.
The Elizabeth Kubler-Ross model, or the 5 stages of grief, postulates a series of emotions experienced by terminally ill patients prior to death. The model was first introduced in 1969 in her book On Death and Dying. This model can also be applied to intense personal change and severe emotional upsets. The first stage, denial. In this stage, individuals believe the diagnosis is somehow mistaken and cling to a false reality. And then anger. When denial does not work, they become frustrated. Why me? How can this happen to me? And then bargaining. Usually the negotiation for an extended life is made in exchange for a reformed lifestyle. And depression. I'm going to die soon, so what's the point? The individual despairs at the recognition of their mortality. And finally, acceptance. I can't fight it, I might as well prepare for it. In this last stage, individuals embrace mortality.
Recently, there has been a high level of skepticism about the universal and predictable emotional pathway that leads from distress to recovery. There is now an understanding that grief is more a complex process of adapting to loss than models have previously suggested. S.A. Berger identifies 5 ways of grieving, as exemplified by nomads. Nomads have not yet resolved their grief and do not seem to understand the loss that has affected their lives. Memorialists. This identity is committed to preserving the memory of the loved one whom they have lost. Normalizers. This identity is committed to recreating a sense of family and community. Activists. This identity focuses on helping other people who are dealing with the same disease or with the same issues that caused their loved one's death. And seekers. This identity will adopt religious, philosophical, or spiritual beliefs to create meaning in their lives. George Bonanno, Professor of Clinical Psychology, conducted more than 2 decades of scientific studies on grief and trauma and outlined 4 trajectories of grief. His studies include those from the US and those in various countries such as Israel, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and China, who suffered devastating loss events or potential trauma events. His findings show that a natural resilience is the main component of grief and trauma reactions, He also demonstrated that absence of grief or trauma symptoms is a healthy outcome rather than something to be feared. The 4 trajectories are resilience, healthy levels of psychological and physical functioning, generative experiences and positive emotions, recovery, psychopathology, example depression, PTSD, usually for several months and then gradually returning to pre-event levels, chronic dysfunction, prolonged suffering and inability to function, usually lasting several years or longer, and delayed grief or trauma, when adjustment seems normal, but distress and symptoms increase months later.
Emotional closure. It is important to discover what is emotionally unfinished in our relationship with the deceased in order to successfully complete our own issues around grief and to find closure. To find closure, there is a need to reflect upon our past relationships with them in order to gain self-knowledge, no matter how difficult the experiences were. Grieving heals the shock of death, deepens self-awareness and the capacity to love and show compassion.
And now we will look at the difficulties in emoting correlating to the moon through the signs. Moon in Aries hides behind a masculine denial of emotions, compulsive movement or action in order not to feel. Moon in Taurus, fear of emotional change, compulsive eating and spending to ward off feelings and emotions. Moon in Gemini, rewarded for intellect and not for purely emotional responses. Moon in Cancer, food may be used for comfort, the fierce, tough Cancer shell used as a protection. Moon in Leo, performs rather than communicates their emotions. Moon in Virgo, feels guilty and self-critical about feeling anything. Psychosomatic illness used as a defense against emotions. Moon in Libra, conflict and emotional turmoil threatens peace of mind. Moon in Scorpio, intense fear of betrayal, abandonment and loss. Difficulties in releasing unspoken, secretive emotions. Moon in Sagittarius, intellectualizes rather than feels. Humor used as a defense, concern about ethics and what one should feel. Moon in Capricorn, need for control through suppression. Frozen emotions, depression becomes a habit, striving for success to ward off feelings. Moon in Aquarius, needs to respect the emotions as valid rather than detaching from them, deals with unpleasant emotions in a highly intellectual manner. And the Moon in Pisces, tendency to escape from feelings through alcohol, drugs, psychosomatic illness, or other escape. Repressed emotions can come out in crazy ways that make them frightening.
The water element, emotional, unconscious, psychic. The water element is receptive, ultrasensitive, deep, secretive, protective, moody, tenacious, and enduring. Water can handle real intimacy in relationships. Water types are so sympathetic that they can absorb the problems of others. They have a soothing effect on others. Their intuition and inspiration is expressed through art, poetry, music, dance, and film. Lack of water is one of the most difficult lacks to deal with. It can indicate being out of touch or unable to feel at a deep level and unable to reach emotions in oneself or others. There can be a lack of trust causing fear, loneliness, alienation, and instability.
And here we have some quotes by Paramahansa Yogananda. Death is not as terrible as you think. It comes to you as a healer. When death comes, all our mortal tortures cease. They cannot go beyond the portals of death. Death is an ecstasy, for it removes the burden of the body and frees the soul of all pain springing from body identification. At physical death, man loses his consciousness of the flesh and becomes conscious of his astral body in the astral world. Later, he passes from the consciousness of luminous astral birth to the consciousness of dark astral death and awakens in a new physical body. Death is really beautiful. If it were a bad thing, God would not let it happen to us. It is really freedom and an entry into another higher life. Beyond this earth garden is the infinite land, wherein we meet those whom we thought were lost. To the last day of your life, be positive, try to be cheerful. At the very end, don't think, I am finished. Death will not give you any trouble if you have a clear conscience and if you go with this thought, Lord, I am in thy hands.
We learn from Patricia Walsh that clients with a strong Capricorn signature will quite often begin a regression session saying things like, I always feel it's all my fault. It's all my responsibility. I have always had this feeling of deep grief. These are the unfinished business, fears, phobias, or patterns of the subconscious past life selves, which are governed by Pluto. You are living your past lives right now.
Grief correlates to Capricorn, Saturn, and the 10th house. Keywords for Capricorn: repression, suppression, unresolved grief, perpetual mourning, depression, reflection, old age, fear, rigidity, suicide, isolation, self-defeat, futility, burden, frozen emotions, and mortality. The suppression of grief and other emotional states correlates to Capricorn, Saturn, and the 10th house. Most of us carry a patriarchal control orientation, which brings dissociation from our emotions and therefore a resistance to evolution. Most of us on the planet have learned to mistrust our own emotions. For the soul to evolve, it needs to experience the full extent of its emotions via the natural emotional dynamics, correlating not only to Cancer, but also to Scorpio and Pisces, which make up the water trinity. This is a natural pathway of emotion based on natural laws. Feeling our emotions means feeling the full extent of not only states of pure emotion, such as ecstasy, but also our disappointment, anger, loss, and grief. The act of repressing our emotions then magnifies and distorts those natural emotions. Capricorn also represents repression and suppression. Repression is unconscious, such as a child who doesn't remember being molested. Suppression is conscious, such as refusing to experience one's anger. As we have learned, suppression can take the form of delayed grief or trauma, when adjustment seems normal, but distressing symptoms suddenly appear months or even years later. Global grief, the Pluto and Capricorn transit. With the current transit of Pluto and Capricorn, the archetypes of Cancer and Capricorn are emphasized on the personal and collective level. This means that any buried issues can come to a head. This transit can correlate to an almost total loss of meaning for living, futility, grief, self-defeat, and no sense of real purpose. The worst-case scenario can produce thoughts of suicide or actual suicide. The intention of the Pluto and Capricorn transit is reflection on the past. This typically manifests as depression. Depression is natural to consciousness. It causes us to become aware of what is no longer working and needs to change. It allows us to focus on inner dynamics, take responsibility for what we have created, and to learn in hindsight. A natural part of the process of reflection or depression is to fully grieve that which is no longer working. and that which has ended. Go with the flow, the water trinity. The water trinity is made up of Cancer, Moon, 4th house, ego, Scorpio, Pluto, 8th house, soul, Pisces, Neptune, 12th house, spirit. Evolution is possible only by fully realizing and experiencing the emotional body. Throughout the past 7,500 years of the patriarchy, we have been conditioned to disconnect from the emotional body, from our natural feelings, emotions, needs, and vulnerabilities. The south nodes of Saturn, Jupiter, and Pluto in Capricorn refer to patriarchal conditioning. The north nodes of these planets in Cancer are an invitation into the emotional body. Deeply experiencing our emotional body, Cancer, will naturally lead to desires to probe into the why of our unconscious patterns in order to transform them, Scorpio. Understanding ourselves as a soul will naturally lead to understanding our relationship with spirit, Pisces. Evolution occurs naturally in the direction of the zodiac, from Cancer to Scorpio to Pisces, from ego to soul to spirit. Ceres, Demeter, and Persephone. Distortions and painful experiences. Separation of children from parents. Mother complexes. Mother's grief and fears about children. Attachment, dependency, loss, separation, grief. Eating disorders, starvation, and famine. Ceres is a dwarf planet, the largest of the asteroids. She represents the Great Mother. She is the ancient Roman goddess of agriculture and fertility. She stands for principles of unconditional love, nurturing, providing, and sharing, protection and guidance of children, and she is associated with Cancer, Virgo, and Taurus. The myth of Ceres. Demeter's dearly loved daughter Persephone gets abducted by the lord of the underworld. In her grief, Demeter neglects the earth, all the crops die, and famine spreads over the world. When mother and daughter are rejoined, plants grow again. Ceres' connection to Cancer involves women's issues, family bonds, and emotional states. Ceres, as ruler of Virgo and Taurus, is an archetype of environmental activism, productivity, and the generous sharing of food and resources.
Here we have some quotes by Susan on the deaths of Carrie Fisher and Debbie Reynolds. This is truly heartbreaking and making me cry. I don't usually pay much attention to the passing of celebrities, but this cut to the heart. I think it's because I'm so very, very close to my own daughter and know the same would happen to me if she died. I am feeling every issue, so focused on death and grief. I will drown in my own liver if I get any more scorpionic. It's so primal, mother and daughter, birth and nurturing, and then to have mother follow daughter in death is so deeply sad and painful. With Carrie and Debbie, there is definitely some kind of archetype or primordial chord being strummed to activate the heart chakra, with people grieving around the world. And more quotes by Susan. When I think of the whole thing with Debbie and Carrie, it brings up an archetype of mother and child. That kind of love that others will never know, especially when the child is a girl. And the love of a mother that is so deep that she would follow her daughter in death. She followed her daughter to the other side to continue to be with her in the infinite soul. This is so moving to me. I also want to mention that while we are all grieving the loss of Debbie and Carrie, what I think is relevant is not that they died, but that they lived and the way in which they lived and bonded. They depended on one another in a way that made it impossible for them to live apart, even in death.
Okay, now we come to Brianna's chart, and she's Susan's daughter. Brianna has an emphasized water element operating in her chart. She has Pluto in Scorpio, Saturn in Scorpio, 4th house ruled by Scorpio, Mars in Scorpio in the 4th house, South Node in the 4th house, Uranus in the 4th house, Mercury in Pisces, Sun in Pisces, Black Moon Lilith in Pisces, 8th house ruled by Pisces, Ceres in Pisces in the 8th house, Moon in the 8th house, and the 12th house ruled by Cancer. Susan, Brianna's mother, also has a very emphasized water element in her chart with a Scorpio ascendant, Moon in Scorpio in the 12th house, Ceres ruled by Uranus in Cancer, Mars in Pisces conjunct the IC, 4th house ruled by Neptune, Jupiter in Pisces in the 4th house, North Node in Pisces in the 4th house, 8th house ruled by Cancer, Uranus in Cancer in the 8th house, Black Moon Lilith in Cancer in the 8th house, and the 12th house ruled by Scorpio. Another quote from Susan: "My life is so intricately tied to my daughter that I know I don't want to be here on earth in the physical without her. We have had many past lives together, and I know we were together in our last lives as mother and daughter, although she was the mother and I the daughter, then in Nazi Germany. I have always been a feeler. I've been learning to feel beyond my emotional body to my invisible body and feel everything around me. With such a strong water signature, Susan is clairsentient. Clairsentience is an extremely heightened form of empathy, an intuitive skill of clear feeling or clear sensing other people's feelings, energy from inanimate objects, and communications with spirit." Now we'll look at Susan and Brianna's charts alongside each other. Susan's moon sits in between Brianna's Saturn and Mars on the IC, indicating that both mother and daughter have soul memories of upheaval and loss in the family line. Susan's Jupiter and Mars on the IC makes her very protective of her children. Nodes squaring the nodes indicate sudden separation in past lives. Coming into this life, they are picking up where they left off. Both nodal axes are in the 4th and 10th houses, indicating they were in the same family before. Susan's moon in Scorpio square her Pluto describes an intense love for her daughter, but also irrational fears of abandonment and loss, that is, losing a child, based on past life memories. Brianna's moon in the 8th house, exactly in conjunct Susan's moon, describes emotional crisis and necessary healing adjustments. Susan's Ceres and Aquarius in the 2nd house, ruled by Uranus in the 8th house, carries survival issues and memories of sudden death. Brianna's Ceres in the 8th, ruled by Neptune 5th, indicates loss of children in past lives. This is also indicated by Suzanne's Chiron conjunct Brianna's Neptune in the 5th. Brianna's 4th house, ruled by Pluto and Scorpio, together with Mars, South Node, Uranus, and Saturn nearby, indicates severe loss, trauma, upheaval, and possible violence in past life family dynamics. And looking at the composite chart of Susan and Brianna, they share a very strong water element with Uranus and Pluto in the 12th house, South Node in Scorpio, Neptune in Scorpio, Mars, Moon, Pallas, and Jupiter in the 4th house, Chiron in Pisces, and Black Moon, Lilith, and Vesta in the 8th house. Pluto and Uranus in the 12th house describes past life trauma, victimization, and a karmic debt. Mother and daughter share a strong symbiotic bond. Mars trine Pluto is a leading edge desire to work on strengthening their family structure. Saturn conjunct the South Node indicates the extremes of imbalance and restriction in past lives, now in a relive condition. They are revisiting the dynamics of the past in order to do them in a new way, which builds a new reality. They share Moon Aquarius skip steps. These are recovered via consistent focus on the South Node Scorpio in the 1st house, a desire to transform past life emotional conditioning patterns. The moon, ruled by Uranus conjunct Pluto in the 12th house, is a traumatic signature of suddenly being ripped apart through death in past lives. There is a strong emphasis in the Aquarian archetype, which allows them to view their emotional dynamics objectively in order to decondition from these patterns. The chart is a bowl pattern. A bowl holds things and has something to offer. This is a highly subjective relationship, the emotional dynamics of which can be viewed objectively. Ceres and Aquarius in the 5th house, ruled by Uranus conjunct Pluto in the 12th house, can certainly describe the trauma sustained by the sudden separation of mother and child in past lives. Mother's grief and fears around children, and the symbiotic bond that must be viewed objectively. The chart is a paradoxical chart. With the Libra ascendant, they have a strong desire for relationship, but also for total freedom and independence. They were so highly attuned to each other's needs that they lost sight of their own. They are learning to fit each other's reality in this life. And now, Sue, over to you with your lovely family here.
Don't know exactly when Boomer was born because she wandered into my yard as a puppy in the summer of 1986. I thought she must belong to someone and kept telling her to go home, which she did, but then came right back. So I decided this probably meant I needed a dog since I was about to move into my first real home. She was a cute, wild and crazy Australian shepherd who ran round and round my backyard like a whirlwind, capturing my heart more with each lap. Since she kept returning, I named her Boomerang and brought her with me. She was my girl for the better part of 16 years, and what a character. In 2002, I moved 50 miles away from my hometown of 20 plus years with Boomer and 2 cats, Junior and Phoebe, both of whom I'd gotten with my ex as kittens in the early 90s. He and I had stopped living together in the late 90s after being together for about 10 years. We still saw each other occasionally, but I knew it was time to move on, and physically moving 50 miles away was one way to make that happen. Boomer was with me throughout the entire relationship. Junior and Phoebe were there for much of it, so when they all died one by one over the next 6 years, it was symbolic of the dissolving of our relationship. Same guy had also asked me in around 2003 to temporarily keep Sarrah until he got a place where he could have 2 cats. She was a beautiful gray tabby he'd gotten soon after we split up. The second cat was one he'd gotten after Sarrah, and eventually I realized he wasn't ever taking Sarrah back. She was with me until she died at 18 this past summer, which, although it brought up old grief, heralded the last traces of our relationship finally passing away. As Boomer approached the end of her life, I remember telling my sister that I couldn't imagine my life without her. I had a very hard time processing her death, in part and probably symbolized by the fact that I'd turned to smoking pot to ease the pain. It was a similar scenario with Junior leaving at the end of 2008, only this time with blue sapphire martinis. Then by the time Phoebe died the following spring, I was pretty much shut down and so traumatized emotionally that I couldn't bear to let go of her beautiful, silky, soft, furry body. So I put it in the freezer to deal with later. Life went on, but I wasn't really participating. Weeks turned to months and then into years before I was ready to take her to the crematorium. Before Boomer died, we met this really cute white puppy, full of energy, who lived next door and would periodically escape his backyard to come over and visit. His people weren't home much, and he would howl with loneliness when they were gone, which just tugged at my heartstrings. I talked to him over the fence, reassuring him that he really was loved. One day, when Boomer had been gone about 6 months, and I was insisting that I didn't want another dog, especially not a white one, I suddenly heard myself say to my neighbor after she told me they'd been evicted, "Well, if you don't want Spencer, I'll take him." A month later, this 1-year-old ball of energy moved in with me, Junior, and Phoebe. Linda, you can move to the next slide. I began fostering feral kittens, and he became my dog socializer, nonchalantly hanging out at a safe distance until eventually gaining their trust and convincing them to play with him. I'd socialize them to people, and he'd get them used to dogs. Our adopted ferals would even follow us when we went for a walk. Spencer was born a day before the September 11th, which meant that we had 5 planets in the same sign: Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, and Chiron. His sun was exactly on my Saturn, which is the ruler of both my partnership's 7th and 8th houses, and he was born right after my Chiron return. We had our trials, but he was my partner for 13 years, passing on his own on his 14th birthday in 2015. That summer, the Venus star point occurred exactly conjunct both our Leo Venuses, accompanied by transiting Jupiter in Leo, which kept me thinking, this should be an extremely happy time for us. But all this Leo was being squared by transiting Saturn in Scorpio, and while Jupiter did allow me much grace in the time I got to spend with Spencer, my heart was breaking to know that the Saturn reality was he would soon be leaving me. Again, I couldn't imagine my life without him, but this time was different in that I actually consciously felt and started processing those feelings. Because I knew he was going to die, I did research on the dying process so I would know what to expect. His acupuncture vet had started a wonderful website called Spirits in Transition that provides lots of resources for people with pets at the end of life who want a hospice alternative to euthanasia. I spent as much time with him as possible, and when the time came, I was able to tell him I would let him go. I was also finally ready to let go of Phoebe and took them to the crematorium together. My favorite foster adoptee, Slate, had preceded Spencer to the spirit world a month before him. The night before Slate left, he and Spencer were lying on the floor with their feet touching, like they were saying goodbye and discussing the next life. Beauty, who we called Spencer's wife because she followed him around meowing at him, was also Slate's sister. The night Spencer passed, Beauty was on the floor right next to him, leaning up against his feet, as if they were telling her where he'd gone and what was next. Afterwards, she exhibited some odd behavior for a while, which I attributed to her double grief, and gave her lots of extra love, because I knew exactly how she felt. Waves of grief overcame me for months, lessening ever so slightly day by day. I cried and Beauty comforted me, as did the others, each in their own way. You can move on to the next one now, Linda. Since then, with Neptune transiting both my moon and sun, while Chiron transits Saturn and transiting Saturn activates natal Saturn, one way I've found to deal with that overwhelming grief is by memorializing my furry kids in art. 2 months after Spencer's death, I finally decided that I needed to try and get on with life, so I took a printmaking workshop. My first print that day was of Spencer's beautiful ears. I started printing every week. Next, I did Spencer's and Slate's feet, and Sarrah, and Junior, and Phoebe. It was hard to talk about them at first. Sometimes I could tell people were uncomfortable and a little sad to hear my stories, but they gradually began to participate when they saw that I wasn't going to lose it. And it was definitely helping to mend the holes in my heart that had been created by my pet's deaths. I have spent lots of time by myself lately reviewing the course of my life through astrology progressions and transits. As I approach a progressed new moon in Scorpio, now in the balsamic phase, I'm beginning to see how much I've grown emotionally and have learned how to process my grief over the years. Pretty sure there's a long way to go, but at least I've started.
Thank you so much, Sue, for that sharing. That was really incredible. Thank you so much. And so now we're going to hear from Sarrah. And Sarrah, you'll be talking about your relationship with your daughter, Sydney. So go ahead. Thanks, Sarrah.
Sure. So first, I want to start off with, I got married in 2005. And when you get married, you don't think you're going to go towards divorce. But soon after marriage, I had Sydney, and wanted to point out our synastry chart. So you can see here, my chart's on the inside and Sydney's on the outside. And my moon, Saturn, conjunct. It shows my capacity for nurturing my mother self. And Saturn is my sense of security and wanting to provide security for Sydney too as a mother. The tension of them being opposite Sydney's Sun, Venus, and Mars, and conjunct my Jupiter, highlights the emotional depth of my relationship with my daughter. With Jupiter, we also have the legal matters that I would have as Sydney's mother, and these are highlighted in the synastry chart. If we go over to the composite chart, you can see right away that Pluto and Jupiter in Scorpio, Pluto and Jupiter in Scorpio in the 5th house of children. And also the Sun is at the 29th degree of Scorpio. But also Moon in Aquarius in the 9th house describes changes in the mothering role and the necessity to objectively view my emotional states in order to stabilize the emotions so that I could deal with legal matters. Her father's Sun, not in any of these charts, is a 0-degree Cancer, which caused him to try to take over the role of the nurturing. The stellium in the 7th house here describes the need for mediation and counseling and my desire for 50-50 co-parenting as we went into the divorce process. Saturn is as the handle to the bucket-shaped chart signifies the boundaries that I've had to establish with her father. We now meet and discuss and make sure we don't overload Sydney, so it is more of a collaborative effort, which brings us balance and equality. But it took us a few years to get there. So I wanted to share first a set of charts here of my natal and transits and Sydney's natal and transits on the 15th of April of 2010. And this is a key moment in the process that of the dissolution of my marriage. So this was the moment in my mind that my heart, that really I realized that things were dissolving, things weren't working, and I was part of the one making the change. I had a powerful spiritual experience that changed my life in that moment, and this is the moment that occurred. This was the tipping point of that process, of the process. You can see transiting asteroid Ceres was balsamic to Pluto up there. On my chart, you can see that. And also transiting Saturn was conjunct natal Pluto in my chart in the 6th house. And also the new moon was exactly opposite Sydney's stellium in the 4th. So it's opposite the 7th house Jupiter, but it's also opposite for Sydney's stellium, Sun, Mars, and Venus. So that's the first set of charts. We can go into the next slide. To pinpoint kind of the when Sydney starts experiencing the family grief, this is at age 4. These are the charts that show that with transits. This is kind of the first peak of grief for all involved here, and this was the highlight of the legal aspect as well. This was the date of the mediation. Truly a moment of overwhelming grief related for me to everything falling apart. This is where it's really hard to understand the change on a deeper level as the marriage dissolves, but understanding that this choice is changing everything for my daughter too. And this is where the parenting plan is finalized and issued. And on the day of the mediation, transiting Saturn, if you look over in Sydney's chart, is conjunct Sydney's 4th house cusp. Oh, Sydney's chart's on the left here, I'm sorry. So Sydney's Saturn is, the transiting Saturn is on her 4th house cusp and about to enter Scorpio, where her stelliums are. And then you can also see in my chart, the Saturn is coming up on the descendant. Also, you can see Jupiter was transiting Sydney's 10th house of family law. And then transiting Saturn crosses my descendant, which I just mentioned, which is the dissolution of the marriage, of the relationship in Libra. Transiting Jupiter conjuncts my moon Saturn in the 1st house, which expand my emotions of anger and challenging my emotional stability at this time. And truly, this was a moment I really did not have any stability in my emotions. They were pretty constant and overwhelming. So this was a key moment for experiencing the grief for myself and Sydney. You can go to the next chart now. The next chart shows Sydney's natal and transits on December 10th of 2012, and mine as well. And this is the second peak. This is really where the Demeter Persephone separation begins. I had experienced unemployment for several months, and I had to go outside my city that I live in to find employment, and I found employment in Portland. And so this is the first day of my job where I had to leave Sydney with her father during the week, and I would come home every weekend for 17 months. So basically I had less than 48 hours with Sydney every week. I did manage to get her back on my full week that was mine during the summertime when she was out of school in 2013. But once school started, had to return to the weekend schedule until I could get home with a new work from home consulting job. When I first got to this job in 2012, I think I cried every day for probably a couple of months before it eased up. And I found new friends to help me through the process. And I was creative in how I tried to connect with Sydney with Skype and digital things and telling stories and things like that. So the time from December 10th, 2012, when I first started that job, until I was home May 2nd of 2014, were the most challenging period of my adult life. I struggled every day, wondering when I would get back home, until I had finally found that job to bring me back home. It was difficult being torn from Sydney and trying to rebuild my professional life that had collapsed too. I also had a battle. I had to battle her father so I would be treated fairly, and my decisions for parenting were heard, which took more than a few rounds at the mediation table in court. It eventually got better, but I had to stand up to severe attacks on my role as a mother. I also had to deal with power that challenged me as a mother via legal, the guardian ad litem, and her father, who attacked my changing belief systems. During the process, he took out my tarot cards, my numerology notes and books, and astrology notes in my office and took photos to try and make me out to be unstable in the legal system during our process. Even though he was writing a software program for my numerology a few months prior to the failing of the marriage. So this was an awakening of the Demeter and Persephone separation archetype in my life. And also it helps me recognize it in other parts of my life, but this was definitely the stronger one. So that is, I think, the last slide. And anyone have any questions?
Thanks so much, Sarah. No, not really any questions because, you know, I have been through this process with you. So you've pretty much told us, you know, some very relevant information there. So thanks for that. And thanks for both of you sharing your deep experiences of grief and how you dealt with change. And Sue, you can unmute yourself if you wish. And so
Thanks, Linda.
yeah, thank you so much. And so that brings us to the end of our Zoom meeting on grief, the water trinity, and the mother-daughter archetype.
Thank you.